The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
On this week's show, we welcome back United States Congressman Dan Meuser from the 9th Congressional District. Dan is running unopposed in the upcoming Republican primary for his 4th term in Congress. In Congress, Dan serves on numerous very important committees, that being Small Business and the Border Security Caucus. Also very importantly, especially for this week's show, Dan serves on the Foreign Relations Committee. And finally, Dan was appointed to the Problem Solver Caucus. My heavens, do we need that in Congress. As the deadline is fast approaching for an appropriations bill to fund the budget, we will discuss with Dan the rumored bipartisan compromise that is in the works. If no deal gets done, the federal government runs out of money this weekend. We will also discuss with Dan the war in Israel as well as Ukraine. Finally, be aware that next Sunday, which is Easter Sunday, there will be no show. We will come back up on the air on April 7th. So, again, we look forward to talking to Dan today on these important issues as he is fighting to get a deal done when this show was taped from Washington this Friday.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial, the area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Congressman, thank you for joining the Volpe Report.
Chuck, always a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Well, as I said to you at an event this week when we talked personally, and I invited you to do the show, it seems like you come on this show at like historical moments when history's happening. And for our viewers' benefit, for those that don't pay attention, you're there again at a historical moment. We are, I shouldn't say we, you are, we as a country are watching, but you are working there among and across the aisle, because it's going to take bipartisan support to get a part of the budget passed, at least to get us through the next 4 months or so. About $1.2 trillion is the number I've heard. And the problem is we have a midnight deadline. Now, we're shooting this show on Friday. It will air on Sunday, so the deadline will have passed. And God willing, we actually will have that bill. I expect we will. No one's going to let the government go into complete shutdown and default, I expect. So give me your take on it in terms of what's going on, the latest, and some of, Dan, what's in there, importantly, that you wanted as a Republican, you know, one of the leaders among Republicans in the House, and what the Democrats kept in there. So kind of do a breakdown, because any bill that gets done is going to be a compromise, as we know.
Well, it is a compromise. Look, we've been battling this now for a lot of months, right? We lost a speaker over it. We issued the continued resolutions, and we are here. Look, we, through committee, have people on our appropriations committee, people who I talk to every day endlessly about these appropriations and where things are going. We've all been very engaged in this, okay? Because we're spending the taxpayers' money. And we're spending $2.7 billion as part of the discretionary spending, 2.7 trillion, pardon me, as within our budgetary budgetary authority. Now, it's important that the American people understand we have discretionary spending and we have mandatory. Discretionary, as I mentioned, is about 2.6 trillion. Mandatory is over 4. It's 4.1, 4.2. Actually, those numbers are slightly off. But the point is this: we have discretion over that level of funding, and more than half of it is defense and veterans benefits. So in the end, we are dealing with about $1 trillion that we have allocation over. Now, out of that 1 trillion, we have approximately in this budget, in this plan, in these two minibuses that are passing, as we're calling them, a 3% reduction from that 1 trillion. And I hope people aren't seeing this as I'm trying to rationalize. I'm not. I came into Congress as a serious critic, a cynic of the spending, of how things are appropriated and allocated. But that's the reality of the situation, because of this very volatile, crises-ridden world, frankly, that's been going on now for 3 years and 2 months under the Biden administration. Our military defense spending needs to go up. And certainly our veterans benefits need to continue to be sustained. So that with that on the rise, even though that's the case, discretionary spending overall is being reduced by about $30 billion, about 3% of that 1 trillion. We need to do 3 things, really. And this is all going to be very serious, particularly under the next president. We need pro-growth initiatives. Our revenues under Trump were like 9%. That's huge. I was the former revenue secretary. If we had 3% revenue growth, that was a lot. Under Trump, even with the tax cuts, we had, it went from 3 to 6 to 9 to almost 10. Yeah, and even in 21, it was that high. And then it started plummeting. Small businesses, for instance, their revenues, because their profits are gone, the tax revenues are gone. So we need to have pro-growth initiatives. We cannot raise taxes because that burdens business. We need to keep taxes at the right point, so as we maximize revenues at the most competitive tax rates that we need to run government. And so I don't just advocate for low taxes. I advocate for competitive taxes to allow that max min to be hit. The second thing we need to do is absolutely we need to do reforms on the mandatory side of the ledger, and there are ways of doing it, and has nothing to do with cuts. Everybody says, oh, the Republicans want to cut Social Security, want to cut Medicare. Absolutely not. But we do need to save it. People paid into Medicare. People have paid into Social Security. There's no reason anyone expecting Social Security and Medicare should see any reductions whatsoever, and the inflation adjustments should continue. But there's waste, abuse, and fraud. There's other things that can absolutely be done that will be very acceptable to our economy and our society. And the third thing is we can't continue any wasteful spending. This administration, Chuck, spending $240 billion on charger ports for electric vehicles.
That no one's buying.
$240 billion.
That no one is buying or wants. They don't want.
Another $100 billion in rebates for rich people to buy a $70,000 electric vehicle. So and get an $8,000 rebate, and they're still not buying it. All the other green energy initiatives, it's insane. And then how about the $500 billion in student loan forgiveness? Okay, you can't do these things. When we have crises around the world, again, created by this administration, that just adds to the madness. And that's why we're at $34 trillion. We got to protect every dollar moving forward, and we have to be very serious about our budget. And we need to be transparent. And you know what? It ain't going to happen under Biden. You're going to have another 4 years of spending from here. I can't even say to the moon, okay? To Pluto.
What do you figure our border will look like, Dan, after 4 more years? We've already had, and counting, and as I'm speaking and counting, well over 6 million people in the 3 years of Biden's administration. It went from 1 point something to a little over 2. In the last year, over 3 million people last year alone. Everyone a record, and it's growing bigger. And you said he's doubling down on the Green New Deal and spending money for electric cars and electric charging stations that don't work. And follow me on this, and I hope the people that are being charged by coal-fired plants and being fired by diesel fuel that they hate, but that's like an inconvenient truth, Dan. We don't talk about that part. And by the way, only 7% of new car sales last year were for electric vehicles. But we're putting all this money that we don't have into electric vehicles. Go ahead.
That's right. I'm just going to add on the border. Look, I had a meeting the other day with the former CBP commissioner, Mark Morgan, as well as Tom Hammond, the former ICE director. And I want to tell you something. Once again, just like when I visit the border, It's just such another wake-up call as to the disasters, the real disasters of death, the number of people that are dying crossing the Rio Grande, just crossing the trek, over 1,000. 1/3 of the women are being abused. The cartels are running it all. They're making fortunes on human trafficking as well as the drugs. 100,000, mostly young Americans, are dying. The drugs are coming in from over the border. The crime, the migrant crime, the cost to the American taxpayer, it's up over $270 billion more since a year since Biden has gotten in. And now let's talk about the gotaways, 1.6 million. Why would an individual, an illegal, come across and not just say, hey, I'm here, and get asylum adjudication 5 years down the line, get money from the NGOs, get a ride to wherever they want? Why do they do that? Because 1.6 million of them know that they have a criminal past or something, so they're going elsewhere. I mean, this is bad. And then over 200 that are on the terrorist watch list. Look, and Biden continues to do nothing. People say, oh, pass the Senate bill. Look, I'm telling you, the Senate bill would not even come close to fixing the problem. These guys told us the other day that the cartels have already have 5,000 people a day prepared to come across. They've already responded to the possibility of that bill passing. That's how orchestrated this is. And all that money is doing is facilitating more illegals. The money was all for processing and resettlement. Okay. In this budget that we're passing today, which I think we'll pass today anyway, we got $3 billion more dedicated to enforcement. The American people need to understand that. So these are things that don't make the headlines and all, but this is the reality of the situation. But my God, and you know what? And this administration is refusing to change course. Look what's happening in Texas. Texas is protecting its border, and the Biden administration is suing them over and trying to stop them from doing it. And I think you know this, and Mayorkas had the audacity, had the stupidity to issue a memo to CBP. If you're talking to an illegal for more than a few minutes, ask them what pronoun they prefer. The Secretary of Homeland issued that memo a few weeks ago.
Dan, we're living in in a place. I can't believe we're having these conversations. Let me get back to a point I made earlier. While all this is going on, what does Biden do when every major car manufacturer has said, we're done with electric vehicles, we're not producing them, we can't sell, our lots are filled with these piles of junk that nobody wants? So what does the president do recently? He doubles down on his Green New Deal. He moves up the deadline for when American car manufacturers have to go completely electric in all the cars they produce by now the year 2030, instead of going back, as they said he would, he went forward. There's that. And here's the second thing. I'm hearing Democrats across this country. They have obviously gone to some national conference with their political strategists. And they're saying, how do we answer Republican charges? We're going to get buried in this election. Our border is a catastrophe. We have 10 million illegals in the country we didn't have before. We have the worst economy, the highest inflation. We can't afford to put gas in our car. We can't afford to heat our homes because they destroyed all energy production with their war on energy. With all that going on, we have to tell the voters something. Well, here's what they came up with. One, the high prices are corporate greed, and it's something called shrinkflation. They invented a word. So here's what shrinkflation is. When you go to buy that Clark's bar at the candy store, you're going to find it's a little smaller than it was before. That's what shrinkflation is. So, yeah. I mean, like, I used a line in this show, and I got clearance from the producers and the ownership of the station that I was allowed to say this. So I'm going to say it now. I learned this from my dad, and I loved it. My dad would have a way of saying things when you were just completely giving him a bunch of bull crap. He'd say, don't piss down my leg and tell me it's raining outside. That should be the slogan on every bumper sticker, because that's what the Democrats are doing. They're peeing down the back of every American and tell them, don't pay attention to that. It's just raining outside.
I've heard that one, and I think I uttered it during the State of the Union. Maybe not loud enough for the president to hear it or to make media.
Yeah. It's unbelievable, Dan. Let's take a moment to turn our attention before I want to get into some of the great projects and things you brought back to your area before we sign off, because especially in this media market, I want you to be able to tell people what's going on. But we have to touch on the situation in Israel and Ukraine, but I'm going to highlight Israel. In fact, in this show, when we sign off, I do a view attacking Chuck Schumer's hypocritical, disingenuous, lying speech when he had the audacity to interfere with the sovereignty of Israel, our greatest ally in the Middle East for 70 years, the only democracy in the Middle East. And he basically said they should overthrow their government, get rid of their prime minister, and replace them with somebody who will be amenable to a ceasefire and a two-state solution. So, your comment.
Oh, I would just say that Chuck Schumer is a bad guy. I mean, why? It's a political commentary. He was dead wrong. This is not about Netanyahu. They always like demonizing an individual. They like comparing Netanyahu to Trump, so therefore he's awful. The entire Knesset, or almost the entire Knesset, I think the vote was 95-4, voted for the type of activity and military operation that was taking place there. But on the same note, look, there's a lot of humanitarian aid going in. There's a lot of nasty things taking place over there. I hate the idea of this level of civilians being killed. There is a war. Hamas continues to say they want to annihilate Israel, that they're going to do this again. On October 7th, they unwarrantedly unprovoked massacred 1,200 Israelis, like 400 young people, 400 children. I mean, insane.
Babies.
So Israel cannot. Yeah, and meanwhile, and now you got Schumer, because he's trying to win some votes in Michigan, stating how this is all Netanyahu's doing. That's nonsense. And I think that will finally be proven that this is an Israel initiative, because they cannot live with terrorists bent on annihilating them on a moment's notice. So they're sending a message to Hezbollah and everybody else that, you do this is what's going to happen. So Hamas needs to surrender. The Gazans need to help the Hamas surrender, and the hostages need to be released. And then there'll be a peace. Then there'll be a ceasefire. Then there'll be peace.
The hypocrisy, Dan, is galling. The Israelis are fighting for their future, their lives, in effect, what we were fighting for. We were fighting in World War II to prevent tyranny and slavery in Europe. And that was a price that had to be paid. God bless the poor civilians that were killed. But we didn't start the war, and Israel didn't start the fight with Hamas.
No, they didn't. So we look. It's a very, very difficult situation. I think there are resolutions to it. Anthony Blinken's over there right now. They are weak in their posturing. Appeasement and begging doesn't get the job done. And they could have taken care of Hamas. Hamas wouldn't let them go. Hamas is the worst sort of terrorists. I've got all kinds of classified information. They're not to be trusted. They're murderers, and they have no regard for human life. So it's a very, very difficult situation.
Regrettably, Dan, we're running out of time. But you have some projects that you have worked very hard on, and I'd like to talk about. You have brought in millions of dollars into your district. One is for a stormwater project, along with a couple others. And I always like to allow this time, when I'm interviewing you or Matt Cartwright or another congressman, to talk about what's going on in your district so people are aware of it.
Yeah. Hey, just real quick on the Ukraine. We have a pretty high
I'm
Ukraine.
Sorry. I did.
No, it's fine. Population. And look, this situation in Ukraine is very serious. Of course, we want to protect our own border just as we want to protect their border. We're going to see some funding bills come across. I'm looking at some very minimal funds for the Ukraine, because I want to tell you something. Putin is a war criminal. Putin's an animal, and Putin's not looking to stop. We have all kinds of evidence he's not going to stop at the Ukraine. And the last thing that we need is a China expanded Russia with the breadbasket of Europe in their hands, Iran, new axis of evil. So we really have to treat this seriously over the long term. But back to home, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, listen, we were able to pull 0.25% of the budgetary dollars for discretionary spending, something we call community funded projects. And for our local area, I was able to get 7 or 8 different projects, primarily because I work very well with the appropriations folks as a committee, as well as because they're good projects. They're from the ground up. There's no nonsense behind them. They're very important. And the one you mentioned, the stormwater project on Susquehanna Avenue out in Sunbury, I was there. They showed it to me. The revitalization of that community was not going to happen without this. So we did get $3.5 million in Luzerne, over in Hunlock Creek, Ross Township. We got some funding for the road out there that had been deteriorated basically for a while. So myself, Rob Ledbetter, Lisa Baker, we just made sure that funding got taken care of, and it did. So we're glad to do that.
That was $2.5 million that went to Hunlock Creek?
$2.5 million. Yeah, I love that area. Certainly in great Pennsylvanians, great Americans. So anything that we could do for that part of Luzerne County, I always do my best. And we've done some things in Berwick. We got some revitalization taking place there. Up in Susquehanna County, a very important bridge project. Bradford County, we got rural broadband money. And again, $1 million here, you know, it in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot, but it helps initiate and helps get these local projects that are so important to our quality of life and our economic development to get them done for our community.
Well said, Dan. As I said, I always say this when you have to leave us. I regret the show coming to an end. I'd like to talk to you with the people listening for another hour or so, but you have to get back on the floor and get money for our country to go on and keep fighting the good fight, so that my grandchildren and your grandchildren aren't a third world country in debt that they can't afford to actually have a country. That's what's at stake.
You said it, Chuck. And just last word, if we did go into a shutdown, look, I'm not afraid of a shutdown. The last thing you want to do in a negotiation is lose the ability to walk away. But I will tell you this, after all these months and months of working on this, I do believe this is the best deal we're going to get with Biden in the White House and Schumer running the Senate. And if we didn't do this, our troops wouldn't get paid. They certainly wouldn't get the pay increase that they're looking to, that we have 5% pay increase. The airports, the federally funded airports would be shutting down. The TSA would be shutting down. There'd be a lot of things shutting down. And for what good? In 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, we'd be in the same point we are. All those people wouldn't be working. They'd be furloughed. We'd have to give them back pay for not working. Who's going to win in that? So we need to do this and then move on to and hopefully get serious about some of these other matters that we've been discussing.
Well said. Dan, thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks very much.
I have to confess, when I first heard Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's despicable and pandering, shameful speech on the Senate floor last week, I was not surprised, just saddened. The speech was proof positive that the national Democratic leadership and the Biden administration are immoral, feckless, hypocritical, pandering ideologues who are so desperate to stay in power they would sell their own mothers. Now back to Schumer's vile speech, which touched a lot of bases, all of them bad. First, he suggested that right in the middle of a war with jihadist terrorists bent on the destruction and murder of every Jew in Israel, from the river to the sea, that Israel should topple its government, throw out its prime minister, commit to a ceasefire, which would allow Hamas to regroup and refortify in Rafah, by the way. Schumer's speech could be some of the dumbest remarks I have ever heard. That would have been like the equivalent of Winston Churchill calling President Franklin Roosevelt to be removed as president after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, or for our European allies to call for the removal of President George W. Bush after al-Qaeda terrorists attacked America on 9/11. I don't remember, after the Normandy invasion against the Nazis, or our island-hopping advance on the Japanese mainland in the Pacific in World War II, anyone calling for a ceasefire for humanitarian purposes. Obviously, that would have let the Nazis and Japanese refortify and reestablish their positions, and by the way, it cost hundreds of thousands of more of American lives. But Chuck Schumer knew all that. Look, even though Netanyahu is unpopular in Israel, and he has his share of legal issues, he rightfully has almost unanimous support. 94 votes to 5 in support in the Knesset to prosecute the war and eliminate the existential threat that Hamas presents. Further, Schumer also knows that the likely successor to Netanyahu would come from another member of the Israeli war cabinet whom, although political rivals of Netanyahu, fully support his handling of the war and would do exactly the same thing. That's how despicable the hypocrisy of Schumer and Biden are. Second, Schumer sees Netanyahu as being an impediment to a two-state solution and therefore has to go. That's a lie. Let me be perfectly clear about this. There have been proposals by at least the last 8 United States administrations, all the way back to President Richard M. Nixon, for a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. And it hasn't happened. And it's not going to happen. Because whether it's the PLO, you remember them, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, or any other governing entity in Palestine, they do not want the two-state solution. They want to annihilate the Jewish state of Israel and every Jew living there. Schumer knows this. Israel knows this. The Palestinians know this. But we pretend that we don't know. And Palestinian leadership pretends that they don't know that we know. Everybody knows. The two-state solution is United States hypocrisy disguised as diplomacy. When will we ever learn that the U.S.'s view of the world and how it should exist usually does not conform to what those peoples and their government want? Does Vietnam ring a bell to anybody? Schumer actually said, with no authority to do so, and I'm quoting him, "Then the U.S. will have no choice but to play a more active role in shaping Israel's policy by using our leverage to change the present course," end quote. Since Schumer knows all of this, why would he be advocating such an immoral, illegal, and unattainable remedy? I have an idea. I'll tell you why. Because we have a president who is deteriorating before our very eyes. In a recent interview in which Biden recounted a G7 summit he attended after being elected president in 2020, he recalled a conversation he had with the president of France, Emmanuel Macron. Unfortunately, Biden referenced that conversation was with Mitterrand from Germany before correcting it back to France. But he persisted with the notion that the conversation was with Mitterrand. Francois Mitterrand was the president of France. He was right, but he died in 1996. Wow. Maybe that's why 60% of Democratic voters don't want Biden as their nominee, and any chance to win re-election will require victories in a few swing states where the margins are razor thin. The Democrats are petrified, for example, that 100,000 plus pro-Palestinian voters in Dearborn, Michigan, which happens to be the district of Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. You remember her. She was censured by her own House of Representatives for her pro-Palestinian rhetoric, including, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," code for the murder of all Jews in Israel. The Democrats are afraid that support for Israel could cost Biden the election. Apparently, they're not concerned that appeasing the pro-Palestinian wing of the Democratic Party might cost them a few Jewish votes across the country as well. Stay tuned.